Rope is worse than iron. Iron just holds you. Rope reminds you, every time you breathe, that someone tied it on purpose. Mine was rope, thick and wet, cutting into wrists that had already gone numb somewhere past the second checkpoint. 14 of us walked in a line through the gates of Blackthorn Keep, and not one of us said a word, because the guards on either side of us weren't the kind of men you talk to. They were the kind of men who answered questions with the back of a hand. I kept my head down and my eyes moving. Old habit. When you have spent 7 years without a pack, you learn to read a room before the room finishes forming. Exits. Weapons. Which guard is bored and which one is watching you like you're the only thing keeping his night interesting. The throne hall of the Alpha King swallowed us whole. Stone ceilings so high the torchlight never reached them. Banners black as pitch, stitched with a wolf's head in silver thread. Hundreds of courtiers lined the walls, dressed like they'd never known mud in their lives, and every one of them turned to look at 14 filthy strangers being dragged in from the storm. I had a story ready. I always have a story ready. Healer's apprentice, moving between territories to treat outbreak fever. It had worked twice before. It would work again, because nobody looks twice at someone who sounds useful and asks for nothing. Then I saw him, and every word I had planned to say fell out of my head. The Alpha King sat at the far end of the hall on a black stone throne, and he looked exactly like the story said he would. Still. Unmoved. A man who had stopped feeling things the day the war took whatever it took from him. Richard Butler didn't glance at the line of prisoners the way a bored ruler glances at paperwork. He studied each of us the way a man studies a debt he intends to collect. His eyes reached me, and he stopped being still. He rose from that throne like something inside him had snapped loose. The whole hall went silent so fast I heard my own pulse in my ears. He walked toward me, past his counsel, past the woman seated at his right hand in a gown the color of dried blood, past guards who didn't dare step into his path. He didn't look at any of them. He looked at me like I was the only person standing in that hall. I stepped back. It was instinct, not courage. My spine hit the shoulder of the woman chained beside me, and there was nowhere left to go. He stopped close enough that I could see the storm still dripping off his hair, close enough to smell cedar and rain and something underneath both of those that made my knees forget their job. He lifted his hand, slow, like he expected me to vanish if he moved too fast, and pressed his palm against my jaw. "Where have you been?" he said. I didn't understand the question. I had never seen this man before in my life. "I don't know you," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "No," he said quietly. "But I know your eyes." Somewhere behind him, a man cleared his throat like he intended to object. Richard didn't turn around. He raised his voice instead, and the whole hall felt the weight of it land. "Cut her loose." Nobody moved fast enough for him. He crossed the space himself, drew a blade from his own belt, and sliced through the rope at my wrists like it had personally offended him. Blood rushed back into my hand so hard it burned. "Your Majesty." The woman in the dried blood gown started. "I have spent 7 years looking for this woman," Richard said, still not looking away from me, "and she is not leaving this hall in chains." I should have felt relief. Instead I felt something closer to fear, because a stranger with that much certainty in his voice is either telling the truth or about to ruin your life, and I had learned the hard way that there is rarely a difference. They took the other 13 to the barracks to be questioned about their reasons for crossing the border. They took me to a private chamber off the hall, and I remember thinking, as the door closed behind me, that I had gone from prisoner to something I didn't have a name for yet, and both of those things could still get a person killed. They gave me a room instead of a cell, which told me everything about how little they trusted the arrangement to last. It had a real bed, a fire already lit, and a window that didn't have bars, which was either kindness or the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how far someone can run before your soldiers catch her. I chose to believe it was both. A servant brought dry clothes and left without meeting my eyes. I changed slowly, cataloging the room out of habit. One door, one window, a drop of maybe 15 feet onto stone. Survivable if it came to that. I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I sat by the fire and let myself remember, for the first time in years, the life I'd built out of nothing since the day my pack watched me walk away and didn't send anyone after me. 7 towns. 7 names. I had been a laundress in one, a scribe's assistant in another, a woman who set broken bones for coin in a third, because a girl with no pack learns fast that no single skill keeps her fed for long. I had never stayed anywhere past the season people started asking questions I couldn't answer. I had never let anyone close enough to notice the shape of the life I was hiding. And now a king with a crown and a scar that matched mine was standing on the other side of a door, insisting he'd spent 7 years looking for exactly the kind of woman I'd worked so hard to stop being. Richard came himself, an hour later, and didn't knock so much as announce his presence by simply being in the doorway. "You're not what I expected," I told him, because saying nothing had never once made me safer. "Neither are you," he said. "I expected you to be older. You've been looking for someone younger than me?" "I've been looking for someone I met 7 years ago," he said, "who should be exactly your age now, and isn't dead, which is more than I let myself hope for most nights." I sat on the edge of the bed because standing suddenly felt like too much effort. "I've never met you." "You don't remember me," he said. It wasn't a question, and it didn't sound like an accusation either. It sounded like a man confirming something that hurt exactly as much as he expected it to. "Should I?" He didn't answer that. Instead he asked where I had lived the past 7 years, and I gave him the short version, moving, working, never staying anywhere long enough to be found by anyone who might remember I existed. I left out most of the truth, the way I always do, because the whole truth has cost me things before and I wasn't ready to hand it to a king I'd known for 2 hours. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He had the kind of attention that missed nothing, the same way I did, and for one strange second it felt like looking into a mirror that had a crown on it. "You watch the door like you're waiting for someone to come through it wrong," he said. "Old habit. A habit you shouldn't need here." "I'll believe that," I said, "the day it's true." He laughed. It surprised both of us. It was short and rough, like something that hadn't been used in a long time, and for a moment the terrifying king the stories warned me about looked almost human. "They said you hadn't laughed in 3 years, I said, before I could stop myself. "In the border towns. That's the story people tell about you. A king who stopped feeling anything after the war." "They were wrong about one thing," he said, and didn't explain which one, and left before I could ask. That was the moment Shirley Carpenter chose to appear in the doorway behind him, and the warmth in the room dropped 10 degrees before she said a single word. Shirley Carpenter had spent 3 years preparing to become Luna, and she wore that preparation like armor, perfect posture, a gown too fine for a hallway, and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Richard," she said, "the council is asking questions I can't answer for you." "Then let them ask me directly," he said, without turning around. She looked at me the way you look at a stain you're trying to decide whether you can still remove. "And who exactly is this?" "Jamie," Richard said. "Jamie Gurule." "A Packless woman," Shirley said, like the words themselves were the accusation. "A woman who saved my life 7 years ago and disappeared before I could learn her name," Richard said. "I'd think that earns her a room and a door that isn't locked, at minimum." Shirley's expression didn't crack, but something behind it did. I watched her decide, right there in that doorway, that I was a problem she intended to solve. She didn't say another word to me. She didn't need to. Some people tell you exactly what they've decided about you without opening their mouth again. After she left, Richard turned back to me, and I noticed for the first time an old scar across the back of his left hand, the kind that comes from a wound stitched by someone in a hurry, in bad light, with whatever thread was available. He noticed me noticing. You did this, he said, tracing the scar with 2 fingers. 7 years ago. A storm, a barn, a wolf who shouldn't have survived the night. My own hand ached, an old phantom memory of the same night. I had a matching mark on my palm from a blade I'd used to cut fabric into bandages in the dark, working by feel because I hadn't dared light a lamp. I found him half dead in a barn, I said slowly, and I let him go before my pack found out I'd helped him. That was me, Richard said. The room went very quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window and turned the last 7 years over in my head, trying to find the shape of a truth I'd never let myself examine too closely. I had told myself for years that I helped a stranger because it was right, and then I paid for it, and that was the end of the story. I had never once let myself wonder who he'd been, or what he'd become, or whether the man I bandaged in the dark had ever thought about the girl who did it. Now I knew. He'd become a king. And he'd spent 7 years looking for a girl he never even got a name from. By morning, the whole court knew a stranger scar had matched a stranger story, and by midday, the whispers had already curdled into something uglier. I overheard 2 courtiers in the corridor outside my room, not bothering to lower their voices, wondering aloud how convenient it was that a packless woman with no proof and no witnesses had shown up at exactly the right moment to claim a life debt from their king. I didn't cry. I'd used up my crying years ago, back when it still felt like it might change something. Instead I walked straight past them with my chin level, and one of them had the decency to look uncomfortable. Richard found me an hour later and must have read the whole exchange off my face, because he didn't ask what happened. He simply said, "Ignore them," in a tone that suggested he intended to do something considerably less gentle than ignoring anyone on my behalf. "I don't need you fighting my battles," I said. "I'm not fighting them for you," he said. "I'm fighting them because they're lying in my own hall, and I don't tolerate that from anyone, mate or otherwise." That word sat between us for a second. Mate. He hadn't said it yet, not directly, and something in me had been bracing for it since the throne room. "Is that what this is?" I asked. "A mate bond, and the rest is just a story you've built around it to make it feel like more?" Something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, like the question had actually hurt him. "I wanted to find you before the bond ever confirmed anything," he said. "Ask me again in a year if you still think that's the only reason I'm standing here." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't know if I believed him, not completely, not yet. But some part of the wall I'd spent 7 years building cracked just slightly, and I hated how good that felt. He offered to show me the grounds that afternoon, and I said yes before I'd fully decided to, which told me something about how quickly the wall was cracking. We walked past the training yards, past a kennel of hounds that didn't so much as growl at him, past a garden that had clearly been someone's careful project long before either of us arrived. He knew the name of every guard we passed. He asked after a sick child belonging to one of the stable hands by name, and the man's whole face changed when the king remembered to ask. "You don't act like the stories say you should," I told him. "The stories are useful," he said. "Enemies behave better around a man they're afraid of. I've never seen the harm in letting them believe I stopped feeling things. It's kept more people alive than the truth would have." "And the truth?" "The truth," he said, "is that I feel most things exactly as hard as I always have. I simply learned not to let anyone see it land. Except me." "Except you," he agreed. "You're the only person in 7 years I haven't been able to keep that door closed against." Zachary found me 3 days later, in the garden, where I'd started taking early walks because the silence there was easier than the silence in my room. He introduced himself as the king's strategist, which was true, and let me believe for the first several minutes that he was simply making polite conversation, which was not. "You should understand something about court," he said, watching a hedge as though it deserved his full attention. "Sentiment doesn't hold a kingdom together. Alliances do. Records do. A woman with no family, no pack, and no proof of anything she claims is not an alliance. She's a liability someone else will eventually exploit. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you, he said, on how quickly this court can turn on someone it decides is convenient to blame. And if I'm telling the truth? Then it's a shame the truth so rarely gets to speak for itself before someone else decides what it means, he said, and smiled like the sentence had cost him nothing at all. He left before I could ask him what, exactly, he thought I was convenient for blaming. I found out 4 days later, when he produced a set of documents in front of the full council claiming I had entered the kingdom under a false name, using forged travel papers, 3 months before I was ever captured at the border. It was a lie. Every word of it. But a lie with paperwork attached moves through a room faster than a truth without any. Shirley cornered me the following evening, in a corridor with no one else in it, which I understood immediately to be deliberate. You should leave, she said, without any of the pleasantness she'd worn in front of Richard. Not because I'm ordering you to. I don't have the authority to order you to do anything, not yet. But you're not going to win this, and I'd rather you understand that now, before it costs you something you can't get back. I never asked to be Luna, I said. Everyone says that right up until the crown is close enough to touch, she said. You think I don't know what it looks like to want something you were never supposed to have? I've spent 3 years earning a place you walked into on the strength of a scar and a story no one can prove. I'm not trying to take anything from you. You already have, she said, and for one unguarded second I saw something under the composure that looked almost like grief. Then it was gone, and the mask came back down, and she walked away before I could decide what to say to a woman who hated me for reasons that weren't entirely unfair. Richard overheard part of it. He didn't say anything about Shirley when he found me minutes later, only asked, quietly, why I looked like I'd been in a fight I didn't start. I don't understand why you keep looking at me like I'm something precious, I admitted, before I'd meant to say it out loud. I've spent 7 years being someone nobody looks at twice. I don't know what to do with this. He almost told me something then. I watched him get right up to the edge of it, whatever it was, and then a guard interrupted with word that the council had reconvened without waiting for the king's permission, and the moment closed before either of us could finish it. The scandal broke like weather. One morning I was a curiosity the court whispered about behind their hands, and by that evening I was standing in the center of the throne hall while Shirley read Zachary's documents aloud to a room full of people who had already decided, before she finished the first sentence, that I was exactly the kind of woman who would do what she was describing. She entered under a false identity, Shirley said, established herself as a healer to gain sympathy, and waited for the right moment to claim a life debt from our king. That is not fate. That is a plan. I stood there and let the words land, because arguing in that moment would have looked exactly like guilt to a room already leaning that direction. Richard stood beside his throne, jaw tight enough that I could see it from across the hall, and I understood in that second that if I let him fight this for me, I would spend the rest of my life being the woman the king rescued rather than the woman who stood on her own. I don't need a king to speak for me, I said, loud enough to carry. I'll answer for myself. I laid out the truth as plainly as I could, the storm, the barn, a wounded stranger I never asked the name of because asking questions like that got you killed faster than helping did. I told them about the 7 years since, the moving, the small towns, the work I'd done with my hands to survive. I didn't have documents. I had a scar that matched his, and a story that hadn't changed once in the telling, which is more than most lies can manage. It wasn't enough to convince the whole room. But it was enough to make some of them pause, and a pause is a place a person can work from. That night I lay awake and made myself a promise I should have made days earlier, that I would not wait in a room for other people to decide what happened to my own name. If Zachary had built a lie with documents, then somewhere those documents had a beginning, and beginnings leave marks. I intended to find them myself. Sean found me in the kitchens the next evening, where I'd gone because I needed something to do with my hands. He was one of the guards who'd never treated me like a suspect, and he told me, carefully, quietly, that court rumors move through servants long before they move through nobles, and that if I wanted to know who actually started a rumor, the kitchens were a better place to ask than the council chamber. People talk different down here, he said, sliding a mug of something warm across the table without being asked. Nobody's performing for anyone. If Zachary's documents came from somewhere, somebody carried them. Somebody always carries them. Any idea who? Not yet, he said. But I'll ask around without asking too loud. Scott, who worked the stables, mentioned almost offhand 2 days later that a set of travel papers matching the ones Zachary presented had gone missing from the border registry 2 months earlier, around the same time Zachary had made an unannounced trip north. I only remembered because I was the one who saddled his horse, Scott said. Man doesn't usually travel without an escort. That trip he went alone, and he told the stable master it was hunting. Did he come back with anything? Come back tired, Scott said, and in a mood nobody wanted to be around for a week. Christy, who kept the household accounts, found me the following afternoon with a small stack of paper under her arm and an expression I was beginning to recognize as the look of someone who'd noticed a detail nobody else had thought to check. The ink, she said, laying 2 documents side by side. Look at the color. This one's supposedly 3 months old. This one was written last week. Tell me what's different. I looked. I didn't see it at first. Then I did. The older document had faded at the edges the way ink does with time, and the one Zachary presented to the council hadn't faded at all, despite claiming to be the same age. Fresh ink, I said. On a document that's supposed to be months old. Fresh enough that I'd stake my position on it, Christy said. Whoever wrote it wasn't careful, or didn't think anyone would look this closely. And Ollie, who was young enough that nobody thought twice about him carrying trays in and out of the strategist's study, mentioned, entirely by accident, over a meal none of us were really eating, that he'd seen Zachary burning papers in his hearth the same week the scandal broke. I wasn't spying, Ollie said quickly, when he realized what he'd told me. I was only bringing his tea. He told me to leave it and go, and I did, but I saw the fire before I left, and it looked like more paper than a man usually burns just to stay warm. You just helped me more than you know, I said, and for the first time in days, I almost laughed. Does that mean I get to stop bringing him his tea? Ollie asked, entirely serious, and this time I did laugh, and it felt like the first honest laugh I'd had since the storm that brought me through the gates. I told Richard what I'd learned, and he didn't react the way I expected. He didn't celebrate. He went still and quiet, the way he'd been the day he first saw me across the throne hall, except this time the stillness had teeth in it. You went looking for this on your own, he said. You could have been hurt. I've been taking care of myself for 7 years, I said. I don't need permission to keep doing it. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take it back. You want to protect me. I understand that. But if you wrap me in enough protection, I stop being a person who can stand next to you and start being something you keep safe in a room. I've already lived in a room like that. I won't do it again. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought I'd pushed too hard. Then he said, I'm not afraid of losing the argument, Jamie. I'm afraid of losing you. Those are different things, and I don't always separate them as well as I should. Then trust me to stand next to you instead of behind you, I said. That's the only version of this I know how to survive. All right, he said, quiet and steady, like he meant it more than he'd meant most of what he'd said to me so far. Next to me. Not behind. It was the first time either of us had said something that honest out loud, and it changed the air in the room. Tell me the truth, I said. All of it. What happened 7 years ago, and why it matters enough that you never stopped looking. So he did. He told me about a mission gone wrong, an ambush near the northern border, a wound that should have killed him before morning. He'd been traveling without his usual guard, chasing a rumor about a rival pack that turned out to be a trap set specifically for him. 3 of his own men didn't make it out of the ambush. He crawled the last stretch alone, bleeding from a wound in his side that had already started to close wrong, and collapsed in a barn he chose only because it was the nearest roof. He told me about waking to a hand pressed hard against the wound, stopping blood he hadn't realized was still leaving him. He told me the girl working over him in the dark hadn't asked his name, hadn't asked what side of the border war he belonged to, hadn't asked anything at all except where it hurt worst. He told me he woke once, briefly, and saw her eyes before the pain pulled him back under, and that those eyes were the only clear memory he carried out of that night. "You were gone by the time the fever broke enough for me to sit up," he said. "I asked the farmer who owned the barn if he'd seen you. He said a girl had come and gone before dawn and he hadn't caught a name either. I searched every barn and every farmhouse within 2 days' ride for a month before I accepted you weren't going to be found that way. I didn't dare stay," I said. "My pack had marked you as an enemy they intended to deal with before morning. If they'd found me helping you, they wouldn't have exiled me. They'd have done worse. I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it then. I only knew someone had saved my life and vanished, and I couldn't make myself stop looking, even after everyone around me said I should let it go. 7 years is a long time to keep looking for someone with no name." "It is," he agreed. "I told myself for the first 2 years it was a debt I owed you. By the 3rd year, I stopped pretending that was the whole reason. I thought about you longer than made any sense for a stranger I met once in the dark, and I never once managed to talk myself out of it. So if I hadn't been your mate," I said, "you still would have wanted to find me?" "I already had," he said. "For 7 years. The bond didn't start that. It just told me I was allowed to stop searching. I don't remember deciding to close the distance between us. I only remember that one moment there was space, and the next there wasn't, and for the first time since I was 16 years old, I let someone hold me without keeping half of myself ready to run. We stayed like that a long while, neither of us saying anything, because some truths don't need more words piled on top of them once they've finally been said. When he finally spoke again, his voice had gone rough in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "I need you to know," he said against my hair, "that whatever the council decides, whatever Shirley or Zachary throw at us next, I am not letting 7 years of looking for you end because a room full of frightened people can't imagine why a king would choose someone they don't understand yet." "They might not have a choice about understanding," I said. "I'm not planning on disappearing twice." He laughed at that, low and warm, and for one night at least, the fear that had been living under my ribs since the throne hall went quiet. There was a night, before any of the true danger started, that I still think about more than most of the others. Richard found me on the wall above the eastern gate, where I'd gone because the height reminded me of a hill outside one of the towns I'd once lived in, the only place in 7 years I'd ever felt something close to peace. He didn't ask why I was there. He simply climbed up beside me and sat, close enough that our shoulders touched, and for a long while neither of us said anything at all. "Tell me something true," he said eventually. "Something you haven't told anyone else." I thought about it a long time before I answered. "I used to make up names for the wolves I passed on the road," I said. "Whole lives for them. A blacksmith with 3 daughters. A widow who kept bees. I never spoke to any of them. I think some part of me needed to believe other people had full lives even if I couldn't have one of my own yet. Do I get a name in one of those stories?" "You'd have been the stranger nobody could get a straight answer out of," I said. "Rich enough to matter, careful enough that nobody trusted him completely." "That's fairly close to true," he admitted, and I laughed, and he looked at me like the sound of it mattered to him more than anything else that had happened that day. "Your turn," I said. "Something true." He was quiet for a moment, watching the torches along the outer wall instead of me. "I used to think finding you would fix something in me that broke during the war," he said. "It didn't, not the way I expected. It didn't erase what happened to the men I lost, or the years I spent pretending none of it touched me. But it gave me somewhere to put all of it down, even for a few hours at a time. I didn't know a person could do that for someone else until you did it without trying. I wasn't trying to fix anything, I said. I was mostly just trying to survive being here. I know, he said. That's exactly why it worked. We sat there until the torches along the wall started burning low, and for the first time since I'd been dragged through the gates in chains, the silence between us felt like something I'd chosen rather than something I was hiding inside. If you're already wondering what Zachary does next now that his lie has started coming apart, stay with me, because this is where everything turns. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Zachary didn't wait for the evidence against him to finish gathering. He moved first, the way strategists always do, and he moved through Shirley, because she was the blade he'd sharpened for exactly this purpose. Shirley called an emergency council the next morning and presented what she called new evidence, a witness, paid or frightened into cooperation, who swore under oath that I had bragged, months earlier, about a plan to trap the Alpha King with a false rescue story. It was a better lie than the first one, because it didn't need documents. It only needed a voice and a room willing to believe it. The witness was a man I had never seen before in my life, dressed like a traitor, speaking with the careful, rehearsed calm of someone who had been coached on exactly what to say and exactly when to stop. I watched him avoid looking directly at me the entire time he spoke, and I understood, even before Christy leaned over to whisper it in my ear, that a man telling the truth rarely needs that much practice at not meeting your eyes. The council turned. I watched it happen in real time, the way a crowd's mood can shift in the space of a single sentence, and I understood that no amount of scars or steady voices would save me this time, because this accusation wasn't built to be disproven quickly. It was built to outlast the truth long enough to do its damage. Richard was pressured, hard, by half his own council, to set the mate bond aside and send me from the kingdom before the scandal touched the crown itself. One councilman, an older wolf with more years on the council than Richard had been alive, stood and said plainly that a king who let sentiment override the stability of his court was no king at all worth following. I watched Richard's jaw work as he listened to that, and I watched him refuse, in front of all of them, and I understood exactly what that refusal was going to cost him. I will not send away the woman who saved my life on the word of a man none of you can name, Richard said, and I will not pretend that a witness too frightened to look her in the eye is more credible than a scar every healer in this hall could confirm matches my own. It bought time. It didn't buy peace. The council adjourned without a decision, which in a room like that meant only that the fight had moved somewhere quieter and more dangerous. So that night, I packed the little I owned and prepared to leave on my own terms, before he lost anything more on mine. He found me at the stable gate before I'd gotten the horse saddled. "You don't get to decide this without me," he said. "I'm not letting you burn your crown down for a woman half your court already believes is a liar," I said. "I love you. That's exactly why I won't let it cost you everything you've built." "You are not the cost," he said. "The people lying about you are the cost, and I intend to make them pay it, not you. And if they win before you can prove it? Then I'll have lost something worth losing everything else to keep," he said, "and I'd rather lose it fighting beside you than hand you over quietly and call that wisdom." Before I could answer him, 3 men came out of the dark near the tree line, and I understood, with a cold and sudden clarity, that Zachary hadn't only planned to ruin my name. He'd planned to make sure I never lived to clear it. I don't remember every second of what happened next. I remember Richard's shout, and the sound of his wolf breaking loose faster than I'd ever seen a shift happen, and I remember running, because that was the only choice left to me, into trees I didn't know in the dark. I remember a hand closing around my arm, and fighting it, and losing that fight before Richard could reach me. Someone struck me hard enough that the trees blurred, and then there was only the smell of damp canvas and the jolt of being carried, and then nothing at all. When I woke, I was somewhere cold and unfamiliar, a low stone room, no window, one door, the kind of place built to hold someone rather than shelter them. My wrists were bound in front of me this time, tighter than the rope at the border had been, and my head throbbed in time with my pulse. I don't know how long they kept me. Long enough for the ropes to bite the same way they had the first day I met him. Long enough to hear, through the wall, two men arguing in low voices about whether Zachary's orders had gone too far. He said hold her, one of them muttered. Didn't say anything about hurting her. He said make sure she doesn't talk, the other answered. You want to explain to him how that happens without a little damage? I lay still and listened, cataloging what I could, two voices, one door, boots that creaked on the third floorboard from the wall. Old habits, the kind that had kept me alive for 7 years before any of this began, came back easily, and I worked one hand loose, quietly, testing the ropes give every few minutes instead of fighting it all at once, because fighting it all at once was how you got caught trying. I thought about Richard, and whether his wolf had reached the tree line before or after they'd carried me past it, and I made myself a second promise, quieter than the first, that whatever happened in this room, I was not going to wait to be found the way I once waited, at 16, for a pack that never came looking. I had one hand mostly free when the door opened, and for a moment I thought it was one of the two men coming to check on their charge. It wasn't. It was Richard, and behind him the sound of a fight that had already ended before it properly started. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just held on to me like he was making sure I was real, and I let him, because some kinds of protection don't cost you anything at all. How did you find me this fast? I asked, once my voice worked again. I didn't stop moving from the second they took you, he said. Snyder tracked the horse tracks off the main road. I would have torn apart every building between here and the border if it had taken longer. I almost had the rope loose myself, I said, and something in his expression cracked open, half relief and half something that looked dangerously close to pride. Of course you did, he said. The truth came out fully after that, because men who fail at kidnapping tend to talk quickly when the alternative is facing an alpha king in person. Both men gave up Zachary's name within the hour, along with enough detail about payment and orders that there was no longer any room for doubt about who had arranged it. Zachary's scheme unraveled piece by piece after that. The forged papers, the paid witness who finally admitted, once Snyder found him and made clear how much trouble he'd already bought himself, that Zachary had promised him a position in the North in exchange for testimony, the missing registry document Scott had noticed weeks earlier, the burned papers Ollie had seen without understanding what he was watching, the fresh ink Christie had caught before anyone else in that entire court thought to look that closely. Snyder tracked the last of it down himself, matching the paid witness's description to a man Zachary had met with twice in the month before the scandal broke, and by the time the full council was called back together, there was nothing left for Shirley or Zachary to stand behind. I stood in that hall a second time, no longer in chains, and watched the same council that had turned on me a week earlier listen to the truth take the lies apart piece by careful piece. Shirley admitted, when it was finally over, that she hadn't done any of it purely out of ambition. She'd spent 3 years believing the crown was owed to her, and watching it go to a woman with no family and no name had broken something in her that ambition alone couldn't explain. I told myself I was protecting the kingdom from an unknown, she said, quiet enough that I almost didn't catch it. I think I was only protecting myself from having spent 3 years on something I was never going to get. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It only explained it, and I found, standing there, that I had more room in me for understanding than I expected. Zachary offered no explanation at all. He'd wanted influence, and I had been an obstacle to it, and that was the whole of his reasoning. He stood very still while Richard read out the consequences, and the only thing that flickered across his face was the particular kind of anger that belongs to a man who is more upset at being caught than at what he did to get caught. Richard didn't protect either of them from what came next, and I didn't ask him to. The days after that felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. I kept waiting for the next attack, the next lie, the next stranger in a corridor with a warning dressed up as advice. It took almost 2 weeks before I let myself believe it was actually over. Richard used part of that time to show me the parts of the kingdom he hadn't shown me yet. A healer's hall he'd built after the war for wolves with no pack to care for them, a stretch of borderland he was quietly working to make safer for travelers who crossed it with nothing but what they carried, a small room off the library that he admitted, a little sheepishly, he had set aside years earlier and never told anyone the reason for, because he hadn't wanted to explain that he was keeping a place ready for a woman he hadn't yet found. "You built a room for someone you didn't even have a name for," I said. "I built a room for someone I refused to stop believing was still alive," he said. "There's a difference, but I understand why it sounds the same from the outside." We spent an evening in that room, and for the first time since the throne hall, neither of us was watching a door. There was still one conversation left before either of us could call the fear fully gone. I found Shirley in the garden a few days after the council had finished with Zachary, standing near the same hedge where he'd first cornered me with his warning about liabilities and alliances. She looked smaller than she had in the throne hall, without the gown and the posture doing the work of holding her together. "I'm not here to gloat," I told her. "I know," she said, and didn't look at me. "That's somehow worse. I understand wanting something for 3 years and watching it go to someone else," I said. "I don't understand what Zachary did to you to make you help him, but I don't think you ever really wanted me hurt. I think you wanted to still matter." She was quiet a long time. "I did love him, you know," she said finally. "Not Zachary. Richard. Or I loved the idea of standing where he stands." I've had a long time to sit with the difference between those two things, and I'm still not entirely sure I know which one it was. "For what it's worth," I said, "I hope wherever you go next, you find out." She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. She left the kingdom 2 weeks later, and that was the last real conversation the two of us ever had, but it was enough to close something that might otherwise have stayed open between us for years. He asked me in front of the whole court, not as an order, not as a king announcing a decision already made, but as a man asking a genuine question he didn't already know the answer to. "Jamie Gurule," he said, "will you stand beside me? Not because a bond says you should. Not because I found you first. Because I am asking you, and you are allowed to say no." I thought about the girl who left a barn 7 years ago without asking a stranger's name, because asking questions had never once kept her safe. I thought about the 7 years after that, spent making myself small enough that nothing could take anything else from me. I thought about how much of my life I had spent surviving, and how little of it I had spent choosing. "Yes," I said. "Because I'm choosing it. Not because I have nowhere else to go." He smiled at that, the real one, the one that had surprised us both the first time it happened in a quiet room with a door that wasn't locked. The ceremony that followed was smaller than the court expected and larger than I ever imagined for myself, no elaborate spectacle, just Richard, and me, and the people who had actually stood by me when it mattered. Sean stood near the door the whole time, the way he always did, watching exits out of habit even at a celebration. Scott and Christy sat together near the front, the two of them having spent enough late nights piecing together a conspiracy that they'd become something like friends in the process. Ollie, who had grown 2 inches taller in the months since the scandal broke, spent most of the evening making sure everyone within earshot knew he had been the one to notice the burning papers first. Snyder gave the shortest toast I'd ever heard at any gathering, for words that made the whole room laugh harder than a longer speech would have managed, and Richard laughed loudest of anyone, which the court had apparently never once seen him do in public before that night. Months later, I stood at the edge of that same throne hall and watched a line of packless wolves being brought in from the border, the way I had been brought in myself, cold and uncertain and braced for the worst. I had asked Richard for one thing after everything settled, and he had given it to me without hesitation, a standing order that no packless wolf crossing into our territory would be chained on sight again. Instead, they would be brought to me first. I didn't have a speech ready for them, the way I once kept 3 speeches ready for myself. I only had the truth, which was enough. I told them what it had taken me 7 years to learn on my own. That being cast out doesn't mean you were worth less. It only means someone else decided, wrongly, that they couldn't see your worth from where they were standing. One girl among them, no older than 16, asked me quietly if the stories about the Alpha King were true, whether he really was as cold as everyone said. I told her the truth. I told her the stories were useful to him once, and that underneath them was a man who had spent 7 years refusing to give up on a stranger he'd met for a single night in a barn. I told her that sometimes the coldest reputation belongs to the person with the most reason to protect what's still warm underneath it. Sean and Scott still serve in the King's Guard, and Snyder remains the steadiest man in this court besides Richard himself. Christie runs the household accounts with the same sharp eye that once caught a forger's fresh ink on old paper, and she's trained 2 younger clerks to check every document that crosses her desk the way she checked Zachary's. Ollie is older now, and still the first to notice the thing everyone else has walked past without seeing. He tells anyone who'll listen that he's the reason the whole conspiracy came apart, and most days, nobody in this hall bothers arguing with him about it, because he isn't entirely wrong. Shirley chose, in the end, to leave the court rather than stay and watch someone else hold the position she'd spent 3 years preparing for. I didn't stop her. I understood, better than most people could have, what it costs to stay somewhere that reminds you every day of what you didn't get. I heard, much later, that she'd found a smaller territory in the East and built a quieter life there, and I found I meant it honestly when I hoped that life had been kinder to her than the one she tried to take from me. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a kingdom once a crisis has passed, one most people mistake for boredom. It isn't boredom. It's the sound of a place learning how to trust itself again. I spent the first few months after the wedding learning to recognize that sound instead of bracing against it, the way I'd braced against every quiet moment for 7 years, waiting for it to break. Richard changed too, in ways the court noticed before I did. He started attending the healers' hall in person instead of sending a representative. He began asking his counsel for disagreement instead of agreement, and made it clear, more than once, that a councilman who only ever told him what he wanted to hear wasn't doing his job. The older wolf who had once stood and called sentiment a weakness in a king found himself, a season later, standing again to say he'd been wrong, and Richard thanked him for saying so in front of the whole hall, because he understood better than most rulers that a court which can admit its mistakes is stronger than one that pretends it never makes any. I built the healers' hall into something larger than it had been, with Richard's full support and no shortage of stubborn arguing between the two of us about how best to do it. We disagreed plenty, about small things and occasionally about larger ones, and neither of us pretended the disagreements didn't happen. I had spent too many years learning to survive by keeping my opinions to myself to start hiding them now, and Richard, to his credit, never once asked me to. I still watch doors when I enter a room. I don't think that habit is ever fully going to leave me, and I've stopped wishing it would. It kept me alive for 7 years. It just doesn't run my life the way it used to. For 7 years, I believed that belonging meant finding a place that would finally accept me exactly as I was. I understand now that I had it backward. Belonging isn't a place. It's a person who never once asked me to be smaller than I already knew how to be. If Jamie's story reminded you that being cast out doesn't decide your worth, subscribe for more stories like this one, where love has to be chosen and not commanded. Comment and let me know where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. A few things this story leaves behind. Being rejected by people who should have valued you does not lower your worth. It only reveals something true about them, not about you. Real love asks. It doesn't command. A person with power who chooses to ask instead of order has already shown you something worth trusting. Influence used to control other people eventually turns on the person using it. Shirley and Zachary both learned that the hard way, though only one of them found something honest to build afterward. Carrying every burden alone isn't strength. Jamie's willingness to finally accept help, without losing herself in the process, was the turning point of her whole story. Small, overlooked details often matter more than they seem to. A servant's offhand comment, a clerk's sharp eye, and a stable hand's memory did as much to uncover the truth as anyone's title did. And the people who once let you go were never the ones deciding your value in the first place. You were.